Thank you for joining me today, Eric, and making time to have this conversation about Platonism. I'm a big fan of your work now. I've been watching your videos, mainly on the Platonism stuff, a couple of debates as well, and very refreshing to hear somebody with such a detailed knowledge of Platonism. And something that I was wondering about listening was, where do you see the value of Platonism now? And I was thinking of John Vervaeke's meaning crisis, the rise of nihilism, alienation, the pseudo-religious cults kind of cropping up, and the slightly eccentric environment of the 21st century. How do you see Platonism fitting into that? Does the meaning crisis, is it important for you in understanding Platonism?
Yeah, I think it's a very real problem. Like, people don't have the tools to interpret, like, the place of human life in the cosmos, ultimate significance, morals. A lot of that can simply be traced to the collapse of mainstream Christianity. I mean, this was like the basic operating system of our whole civilization for thousands of years. So when that collapses, it's understandable we're going to have this void. Now, I think Platonism is uniquely situated to address this because a lot of what allowed Christianity to operate as that foundation for our civilization was itself based in Platonism. And what people went away from in organized religion, the dogmatism, the kind of anachronistic cosmology, not squaring with science and stuff, like Platonism doesn't have those same problems, but it has all of the good philosophical stuff that allowed Christianity to help us make meaning out of our lives.
So you kind of see similarly like the start of the whole thing, the kind of death of God. I know you had the recent debate on Nietzsche with Uberboyle, and that kind of beginning of the Enlightenment creating this divide between the religious world and the scientific world, and that's just been played out, and now we're kind of stuck between the two. It's almost like, to believe religion you just have to be this kind of fundamentalist, creed based, you're just kind of in a group, or else you're a scientific materialist, which is kind of hard to square with being a human being, who
Right.
is conscious and experiences things.
Mm-hmm.
um, and do you see, so then I don't want to put words in your mouth, but do you think Platonism is doing a lot of the intellectual lifting in Christianity to a certain extent? Like, is it, at least
Yeah.
in the beginning, do you think it's better for making the argument for Christianity?
Better to use Platonism to make the argument for Christianity, or that Platonism is
Yeah, I
like,
mean, Platonist metaphysics um, can justify more easily with a scientific framework than, say, Christian metaphysics, or
oh,
that the
yes,
Platonist metaphysics can justify the Christian metaphysics.
both. Yeah, both are true. The more I look into it, the more it seems that both Judaism and Christianity are heavily based on Platonism. So, one hypothesis that I've looked into by Russell Gmerkin is the idea that when the Septuagint translation of the Old Testament occurred in Alexandria, these were Hellenistic Jews who were familiar with the legal and philosophical writings of the Greeks. They had access to the Library of Alexandria, of course. So Gmerkin's thesis is that they actually took from Greek legal theory, especially Plato, in like compiling and codifying the Old Testament. And it is possible that that's the case. We don't have older records of the Jewish scriptures than that kind of third century BC period. So this is potentially a direct Platonic influence on the Old Testament in the first place. And then, of course, around the time of Christ, you have Philo of Alexandria, who is a Platonizing Jew who interprets the symbolism and mythology of the Old Testament explicitly in terms of a Platonic metaphysics. Potentially, Jesus himself could have met Philo of Alexandria because Jesus, from the ages of, I think it's like 2 to 10 or something along those lines, went to Egypt to escape that persecution from Herod. So, yeah, there may be there may have been a direct influence on Jesus Christ from Platonism. I mean, even if you believe he's the Son of God, he learned language, he learned culture from those around him, and Platonism and these kind of mystery cults were all around. The Essenes, one branch of Judaism around at that time, had leanings towards, Platonic metaphysics, this kind of mysticism. Beyond that, the church fathers, many of the church fathers were Platonists. Augustine was basically
Yeah,
a
I was gonna say
Platonist.
Augustine, to be honest, that he
Right.
really makes that for me, I suppose, having been he's the church father that I'm most familiar with, is Augustine, and kind of combining that Neoplatonic framework with Christianity. That was part
Yeah.
of Vervaeke's argument, was that the Neoplatonists provided, he talks about in the Meaning Crisis, that the loss of three orders, the loss of the narrative order, the nomological order, and the normative order, that all come from. And he looked at Neoplatonism as providing that normative order, and that Augustine kind of said Christianity provides the narrative order. And if you put these two together, you have something that's, he obviously took from Aristotle as well, the conformity theory, and how we can actually connect to reality for this nomological order. But I wonder, I suppose, so in terms of rebuilding the three orders, like overcoming the meaning crisis, do you think it's possible for modern people to re-enter, are they re-entering Christianity? Are they re-entering Neoplatonism? Or is this a new thing entirely? Do you see it as like going back, or like, I know people talk about the rewilding of Christianity and like the bush soul of Christianity and this kind of change that's going on. I wonder how you see that.
Right. Yeah. I consider myself a Christian, and I think there is room for a kind of revival of Christianity, just openly acknowledging these influences and reconsidering some of the dogmatism in Christian theology and things along those lines. In the past, I've identified as a perennialist. Plato didn't claim to invent his doctrines. Pythagoras, who Plato largely follows, didn't claim to invent his doctrines. He got them from the Egyptian priests, from the Chaldean priesthood, from all these various mystery schools that were operating. It seems like the core of Platonism is a very, very ancient kind of metaphysics, and it's unclear exactly where it came from. I mean, there was some syncretism of existing spiritual strains. It seems clear that like the Upanishadic philosophy was influential on the Persians, and through the Persians, the Mesopotamian sphere. Ultimately, it did get to Greece. I think you can see that in a figure like Parmenides pretty easily. So if we acknowledge that Christianity is not simply like taking off from Judaism, but there is this like world historical mythic force that was concentrated into Christianity, then the character of that new Christianity may be a little bit more, open-minded, compatible with science. I think the problem really comes down to people having prejudice that the views that they're used to coming from their preferred sources of authority are just like true. And if you can like affect that kind of moral shift and realize like I'm actually doing something wrong when I like blanket statement reject all of these other traditions around the world and say mine is the only true one. It's not that you want to reject the idea that you can reach truth and like defend that truth that you find, but I think it's returning to a Socratic method, returning to like the way that the ancients actually assimilated this perennial tradition, can inform like what to do with the Christian symbology. So I think it's clear that like historical Christianity has committed crimes. It's been guilty of social harms. The same is true of every faith, and I think we kind of just need to get over those attachments at some level without destroying the symbols, without throwing it all away. Like we saw what was wrong in Christianity and we just threw it out. And I think that synthesis can be arrived at in a new way of interfacing with the symbols can be arrived at, especially through Platonism, just because Plato's the right figure in time to assimilate that ancient tradition. He's there in the zeitgeist where these symbols were cropping up in Judea. So yeah, I do think Platonism can be used to revive Christianity and tie us back into like a comprehensive scientific metaphysics.
Yeah, there's so much there, man. A kind of golden thread idea as well that I think is really meaningful. Something I suppose for me is that I was born in a secular family, so I was raised without any religion as an atheist, essentially. Probably an anti-theist would be more accurate because the prevailing attitude was that religious people were somehow delusional, or that there was this kind of um that yeah, it was a big fairy tale or a big con, or like the institutions of religion had just pulled the wool over everybody's eyes. Of course, that's a very alienating position because you're believing that everybody from the past essentially was somehow mentally lower than what we are now, which is definitely not the case. So for me, something getting over that arrogance, I suppose, which comes with being an atheist, I think, that's built into it, also allowed me to re-enter into the tradition of thinkers since, say, Plato, which does, I think, follows on. There is, you could build connections between that tradition from, say, Plato to Plotinus to Aristotle or to Augustine to the early church fathers to see the influence there. But that connection to the tradition is meaningful, and that justifies a certain way of life that's continuous intergenerationally. Whereas I think for modern people, they're very alienated from their tradition. They're very alienated from, if you believe everybody in the past was, out of their minds in a sense, or doing these weird things, then you're very isolated. You're kind of outside it. So I think re-entering the tradition in that sense can be very meaningful and can help to kind of afford that more meaningful worldview. I know in your experience you were raised Catholic, so how did you come to Platonism? Why did you end up there?
Right. I was raised sort of like half Catholic. My mom was Catholic, and we didn't go to Mass throughout my childhood. I was the one to ask to go to Mass because I was curious about these things just naturally, as a kid, thinking about like what happens when I die, what is like kind of the cause of the world in the first place and all of that. And I was really discouraged by the Catholic Church because I would ask the priests like philosophical type questions about these things, and the response would just be like, you can't know God. All we have is, revelation and what tradition has given us through the church. And I just felt like, so I have no place in this. It's just, I'm a passive receptacle here. So I built like animosity up against organized Christianity even as a kid. And I became an atheist for a while, and really went back and forth between atheism and Christianity for some time before I started getting into the philosophical tradition. I think the first like serious philosopher I read, and honestly I don't even want to call him a serious philosopher, but at the time I thought he was a serious philosopher, Nietzsche. It was in a lot of ways responsible for like shifting my perspective and like forcing me into a hard reset. And then I got into Schopenhauer and Plato simultaneously. And since then, like these two philosophers have really been my favorite source to go back to. Schopenhauer has his flaws, but he does have this kind of practical wisdom and this very like common sense understanding of things that just brings a clarity. So I recognized that intuitively. It was like when I was a kid asking the priest about these questions of like ultimate reality and stuff, I had the belief that we can just talk about these things with common sense. We do have this understanding. It's kind of a Gnostic impulse, I guess, that I've always had. And I see that in Schopenhauer. And then, I started reading Plato, but I didn't really put it all together. It seemed like Plato was doing something more pedagogical, something like as an exercise. And it was only much later that I kind of realized that like Schopenhauer and Plato are both addressing this same like very deep and very detailed metaphysical system. After getting into Schopenhauer and Plato, at first I started into more like modern physics theories and like people like Chris Langan with the cognitive theoretic model of the universe. I was really interested in his thought, and you know, I was looking more to like the recent past of our intellectual history to try to make sense of the world and like answer those questions that I had when I was a kid. And I would occasionally like dip back into Plato, and like every time I was just seeing more and more and more in the dialogues, until like in the last few years I've started my reading groups, and we're going in detail and we're reading the Neoplatonic commentators, and I've basically come to the conclusion that like we've hardly moved past Plato. Like we really have not developed in philosophical terms past Plato very much at all. So that's kind of my journey to becoming explicitly a Platonist.
I think we've devolved past him a couple of times, to be honest. That something that I noticed a lot was that there's a lot that missed. When I studied Plato in academic philosophy for my BA, they taught us in the way that you were supposed to abstract Plato's arguments. Like Plato has this theory of forms. You know, this is what he thinks, X, Y, and Z. And they didn't. We read the dialogues, but the dialogues were just presented as kind of facades of what he actually thinks. Like these are just big brain Plato arguing with himself, and that's kind of all they are. Whereas recently I've gotten into DC Schindler's work and kind of third wave Platonism. Gonzalez and Vervaeke talks about them a lot, that this new interpretation of Plato as the 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 dialectic is, or the dialogues are necessary to display the dialectic. That's what the philosophy is, in a sense. He's exemplifying this process, and that Plato isn't actually in it, and
Right.
that Socrates is this kind of representation of the good, but that they're not just these propositional ideas. It's a transformative process. That's something that I think is really missing from philosophy, and well, from academic philosophy, and also from for religion, obviously, because atheist materialists look at religions as systems of propositions, that these are truth claims about the world, but they're also engines of transformation. They're also meant to be something that you go into to transform, to see the truth. And I think that's something that's so core to Platonism, that you have to undergo a personal transformation, i.e., the cave or something like that. What do you think about that element of it? How important
Yeah.
is that for you?
Yeah, absolutely. The kind of like trans propositional, going beyond discursive reason is essential, and it's what Plato is constantly pointing us to. You know, like Socrates displays not necessarily the best logical argumentation in the dialogues, even. You know, Parmenides seems to outclass him in the Parmenides, or maybe it's Zeno. Who does Socrates argue with before Parmenides goes into his thing? May have been Zeno.
Well, he's arguing with Zeno, isn't he, about
Yeah,
Zeno's defending Parmenides,
right.
but Parmenides kind of smokes him,
Yeah,
like
and
the
then
old philosopher.
The Eleatic stranger also kind of transcends
Yeah.
Socrates to some extent in that like explicit logical classification. That is an important part of the dialectical method, but you know, Socrates, the way he engages with the youth of Athens, the way he like integrates what he's doing philosophically in the holistic context of like the fate of Athens, the fate of this whole organic unity that he's a part of. And you know, you get that sense that there is that care, and what we're doing with philosophy is not simply like categorizing and classifying the things around us or these forms. You know, people think of Plato as a rationalist because he talks about this realm of forms. Like, okay, so what? There's like triangles floating out there somewhere, and Plato's like a big nerd thinking about these mathematical shapes and stuff. But really, like, that's not the end of it. The realm of forms also people think of in a very abstract way, in the same way that we would think of the problem of universals. It's like, okay, so you're dealing with redness, you're dealing with these sorts of things, but it's more than that. And the realm of forms for Plato does have life. It does have, like, it affects us, it interacts with us. These archetypes are structuring the world around us, and you can't know them through discursive reason. You can't grasp the essence of things through discursive reason. Iamblichus, in On the General Science of Mathematics, talking about the divided line, you know, the different kind of epistemological faculties that we have, says dianoia, in some sense, runs the reason it's called dianoia, through thinking, is that it runs through all of the faculties. So there is something about dialectics, discussion, logos, that in a way like permeates everything that we're doing, including that higher noesis, including that attempt to like grasp the ineffable, the structuring principles that obviously as structuring principles can't be encapsulated in any logic that we observe here, because it's the source of the logic that we observe here. But discursive reason nevertheless does like move us towards that summit and allows us to sort of get there, even though it itself doesn't carry that final like consummating union with the divine ultimately, which is what Plato is pointing at. The forms for Plato are intelligences as well as just like structuring principles. They're not inert. It's not just a triangle out there. You know, there's something living about it that impacts us.
There's so many paths to go down there that I was just thinking of as you were speaking there, Eric. That's so important. And the to zoom in on the kind of what you were saying about it reminded me of Plato's Republic, which I reread recently, where he's making the metaphor of the constitution and character of how certain political constitutions create certain kinds of characters, but then those characters interact with the political constitution. There's this interplay of personality, but that the one or the good as a kind of the ineffable true reality, but that it's very much about becoming almost like you used archetypes like the Jungian example of this psychological wholeness, moral improvement, spiritual improvement, and that vision of a higher order principle of a superordinate vision of order is necessary to become wholer, or to become more of a singular thing, to become more one, like in Neoplatonism, like Plotinus's whole kind of hierarchy of being that we traverse upwards, and how much that's missing in a secular context is very profound. I think it's a real loss. And I wonder, yeah, I don't want to just throw you the big load of stuff, but in terms of the hierarchy of being and the ethics of kind of the Platonic philosophy, how much do you go into that in your work? Is it important for you?
Yeah, and you know, it's obviously paramount for Plato. He makes Socrates the central character, and what was like realistically, historically, the exceptional property that Socrates had, his courage, his kindness, you know, his temperance, his justice, these virtues that he had. And the Iamblichian curriculum that I use in my reading group starts with the first Alcibiades, looking at this character who, you know, has a lot of flaws. Socrates is showing him this method of looking at himself, turning his attention towards his own nature so that he can begin to reform himself. There is an element of like tragic fatalism that permeates through Plato, where like he chooses to illustrate this with the character of Alcibiades, knowing that Alcibiades goes on to do a lot of like degenerate stuff and make a lot of moral errors in his life. But nevertheless, like, yeah, part of the purpose of dialectics, maybe like the essential purpose of dialectics, is to turn our attention through that scale of like faculties, capacities that we have, which ultimately converge on those like transcendent structuring principles. But the only way to get through them is to regulate the interactions of these different psychological aspects that we have. And ultimately, like, we have to be able to recognize that these structuring principles are not merely transcendent, they're also immanent to us and in our souls. You know, like the koinai, enoi is the term for it in Stoicism, or actually Neoplatonism. Spermatikos logos is the Stoic term for the kind of structuring principles of the world. These are reflected in our soul in Neoplatonism. Souls also reflect each other, and we reflect the being of all of the forms. So you can't know yourself without knowing this kind of abstract metaphysical system, but you're not going to know any of that unless first you regulate those lower aspects of the soul. This tragic fatalism comes up again because Plato believes that, like, in the world, when you have good meeting evil, evil wins. Like, that's Plato's view. Evil is more powerful in a sense in this world than good is. Although essentially evil lacks power, because to do an evil thing is to not know fundamentally what it is that you're affecting. We all will the good. That's a Platonic, doctrine. But in terms of like the influence of bad things on good things, it is more or less always going to go in the direction against the good. But yeah, so we have that like lower aspect of ourselves, the appetitive nature that goes in many different directions and leads us astray. And if we don't regulate that with this spirit thumos, then in the image of like its proper proportion that we know through nous, through intellect, then yeah, in us too, like the bad will prevail over the good.
That is so, yeah, because I mean, the levels of the self connecting to levels of reality, like that Vervaeke talks about it, where ontology and psychology are connected in Neoplatonism, that they're the same thing. Like to
Right.
go through the levels of the self and integrate them is to connect to realer patterns in the world, because you're becoming less self-deceptive, so you're picking up on more real things that in turn you can use to create more in harmony, which you can use to pick up on realer patterns again. And those, even the Platonic theory of the psyche with those three parts, is so profound. Like that's the first theory of the psyche that's just ever created, but it's so powerful in terms of integrating the self, or thoughts of integrating the self. I was talking to DC Schindler in a recent podcast where he described it as philosophical grace, that it was like the vision of the good through the beautiful leads to the true, is something that the transcendentals that we desire are what organize the inner conflict, the three competing, the man, the lion, the lower appetite of self. And it's not this kind of encratic trying to push the parts of yourself into order, where you have, you're pursuing social goods too much, and then you're pursuing appetite of ones, and the man's just kind of stuck in between. That there's the vision of the good is what synchronizes and creates wholeness out of this kind of fragmented mess. And I don't see, do you see, is there a parallel there with Christianity, with the Christian notion of kind of grace, or do you think this is fundamental to Platonism?
I think there is a similar notion uh, in Christianity, especially Catholicism and Eastern Orthodoxy, because like they take off in a big way from the writing of Pseudo Dionysius. Like Thomas Aquinas uses Dionysius, Maximus the Confessor uses Dionysius, and I just recently got into Dionysius, and it reads to me like the kind of Advaita Vedanta doctrine, like Atman is Brahman. There is this core of all of our being that like converges in this transcendent oneness that has to be behind all multiplicity. It seems like that's pretty explicit in Dionysius. He does like say that God is the being of our being, but like we're not the same as him. But then at other times, like he seems almost to point to like a Platonian notion of full henosis, that the goal is to like separate from the created world and reunite with the Godhead. And so the way that manifests though is like fairly systematic with Dionysius, because we do have a mechanism then for that unity permeating the multiplicity that we're engaged in, including in our own psyche. So there is something that's pulling us up, that upward tension pulling us up is there in Christianity very explicitly, partly because Proclus emphasized it so much, and Dionysius, as far as I can tell, really just took Proclus's system and like converted it into Christian language. There's even a reference, and I don't even know, is this a real historical figure, but Dionysius talks about his teacher, Saint Hierotheus, who writes this supposed work, Elements of Divinity. It's like, okay, well, Proclus wrote Elements of Theology, and that's one of the most well-known writings in the Middle Ages. Thomas Aquinas reads it. I think it was falsely attributed to Aristotle, in fact, for a while. Dionysius, the historical figure behind that pseudonym, probably knew exactly where he was getting these ideas from. I mean, he's like one generation after Proclus, 2 generations. So Proclus is always emphasizing the idea that like an ascent is actualized from above. The active participant is always the superior participant, right? So we have to make ourselves receptive to the influence of higher powers. That applies to like our attitude towards our teachers, very similar to like the way Hindus think of the guru. Like you view them as God because effectively, they are the vehicle of transmission of the divine to you. The same applies, when dealing with higher ranks of spirits, things like that. In Catholicism, you really see that where like you pray to Mary, you pray for intercession from the saints. You have all of these intermediaries. Proclus emphasizes this succession of intermediaries, all conjoined by that common ray, the serai, that descends all the way from the one through all the ranks of forms and mathematicals and spiritual entities down to us. And in one sense, this ties us to something transcending ourselves and way beyond ourselves. In another sense, though, like we see that unity permeating down is at the same time the being of our being, most essential to us. So yes, this idea of grace really is, to my mind, as far as I can tell, the same as Proclus's idea of like the ascent via the upward tension.
That's so fascinating. And there's something really that thinking about there in terms of the Platonic ideal. I know Raveki talks about with Plotinus that in that time they identified more as individuals than individuals, that they had this divine double. So an individual had essentially a higher spirit, like you talk about Socrates' as daemon, that you weren't looked at as just this one single monad, that there was this higher version of you, and that was actually the true you. Your job was to, like what Plotinus talks about with the sculpture and the vision of the sculpture, that the sculpture works with their vision and the material until they become one. And so their individual's job is to reconnect with that higher part of themselves, and that journey is what actually makes you one, essentially. And it seems like the nominalism of today makes us think that the future self, the ideal future self, the best possible future self for you, which is a vision of the good, is somehow not real. But the weird thing is that that vision sets the normative constraints for how you behave in the present. It doesn't have the causal powers, so the future self isn't,
Right.
making, you're not making decisions for you. But as soon as you specify that higher order aim, in order to achieve it, you have to do certain things and you can't do other things. So
Right. That's a really good argument for the reality of counterfactuals now that you say that. Like, it's not the way that David Lewis argues, and I think his arguments are great as well. But, like, counterfactuals have causal powers. So if they have causal powers, they must have some reality, right?
it's constraint. Yeah, I mean that was so much for Vervaeke's work in the dynamical systems theory that I read Alicia Uraro's book on it. Very difficult book, but kind of understanding that it's not like backwards causality that the vision of the future self is causing you, but that the aspirational self actually has the normative constraints that specify how you have to act in the present. So the idea that that would be realer than who we are now actually makes a lot of sense, and pragmatically is probably more effective in terms of your own actualization. Because I think a big step for people, you see this with people with ADHD, that ADHD seems to be a problem with not being able to manage yourself across time, not being able to take responsibility for the future. Like the issue is, you in the present, yeah, everything's there, but you can't string it together to organize your future and who you're going to be.
Mm-hmm.
So without that future self, we're actually very chaotic and disordered, and uh, it's like you almost can't see how you could do it another way. But
Right.
yeah, I don't know if you
Yeah,
want to jump on that.
we're encouraged to have a very blank slate perspective, not just on human nature, but of our future. Self actualization, in a way, is like an incoherent idea in the modern zeitgeist because what exactly is it that you're actualizing? And why does that have value? You know, unless you're aiming at something, some archetypal self, divine double, some like perfect image that is there by nature of the laws of morality, the laws of virtue, unless there's an objective truth to like how you could be perfected and that precedes your actualization of it, then how can you be aiming in any particular direction at all? Like if you're one of these people who's all about progress, or like a transhumanist who like wants humanity to develop, like, okay, develop into what and why is it good? Because just change for the sake of change is obviously very destructive and nihilistic and could go anywhere. You know, you can change into a genocidal, dictator potentially. That's probably not a preferred direction. So yeah, I believe that like when we're thinking about our future, we are not like projecting something into some like open field, open canvas of possibility. There are like definite attractor states that are out there built into the laws of nature. There is like a stable thing out there that I think has as much reality as the reality that we have now. You
Well,
know?
I think that's the Platonic position, man. So much that really that justifies that, because the alternative that they aren't real, it doesn't make sense of potential anyway. Even we talk about living up to your potential, and like it already implies a sort of hierarchy of actualization versus potential, which is very kind of Aristotelian. But the idea that we have to um enact this future self, I Peterson has one video where he talks about Carl Jung's theory that what catches your attention is your future self calling to you, essentially, through, because we're drawn towards things that are going to develop us. Our attention functions by developing and develops by functioning. So his argument was that we're actually set up to see things that will bootstrap us to become better versions of ourselves, if we're doing it properly. That's like, and I think so much of it comes down to attention, which you mentioned earlier, which is obviously a key topic for my research as well, and how through attention, through the lens of attention, materialism makes no sense, because you can't see without values. You're valuing one thing over another. So by perceiving things, you're setting up a hierarchy of value from things that are most
Right.
significant to least significant. And Vervaeke talks about that. He's like, to be a cognitive agent, you need an implicit structure of value. So we have this implicit structure of value for perception and for action. The idea that what we have could be perfected. I mean, obviously there's a bad way and there's a good way. If it already, we have an attentional hierarchy of value, it does. I mean, it makes sense that there would be a good version of it and a bad version of it. I don't really see how you could argue against it, but
Right.
yeah.
Yeah, we have certain given constraints essentially as the being that we are, at least as far as our soul is concerned. You know, this distinction between the essence of things and their energies I found very helpful. You know, the essence is that structure of the whole, which in a sense must transcend time, at least for souls. The idea that like we're in a continual process of flux and development, I think can't ultimately account for that unity that holds it all together. Why can it be considered one thing? So in my perspective, you do need some level of monadic self, but like for Leibniz, each monad contains a reflection of all the other monads. So we're not like isolated in our individual self, but there, I think there must be that essence of the soul. And the way that that essence of the soul works in my mind is like it's this kind of crystalline structure outside of space-time. It is your nature that like if you were born in any like slightly different parallel universe or something like that, it would still structure what is in your capacity. You know, what how can you energize is structured by that essence that, you know, can't be alienated because it's that thing that allows the oneness of all of your experience. You know, at a more mundane level, obviously we have a genome that conditions what's possible for us. Like not everyone is going to be in the NBA. That's just how it is. So we have to attune to our essence and understand our essence, know ourselves in order to see what we can do. You know, that's a very radical idea these days because we think that essence is totally mutable.
That is incredibly important in terms of the idea, the know thyself. Like I love Vervaeke's line on that, which is that it's know the principles that are guiding your actions. That it's this, it's not an autobiography; it's more of an owner's manual. He says, which I thought was so interesting because we do have. When you were speaking there, it was reminding me of Carl Jung's idea of the shadow, that we have this potential self in that's hidden. As soon as we specify that we are something, we also specify that we're not something in the same sense. So we're
Right.
continually, by being something, we build up this opposite shadow essentially, and that development takes place by dipping into that shadow self to reclaim the things that are within that that aren't essentially conscious that we need to solve problems or to face the kind of the circumstances that are presented to us by the environment. And yeah, I wonder, do you see, it was something I was going to ask you about a minute ago, which is the connection between Carl Jung and Platonism, because Pierre Grimes talks about Jung in terms of that he's obviously based on Hermetic philosophy, but he argues that Hermetic philosophy is just Middle Platonism, that there was evidence that
Yeah.
Hermes Trismegismus wasn't, well, they thought he was a contemporary of Moses or whatever, but that he was actually a second century, third century Middle Platonist. So do you see Jung's theories as connecting to Plato?
Oh
Is
yeah.
is that something you're interested in? Yeah.
I think Jung was a Platonist. I mean, his preferred philosophers, as far as I'm aware, was Schopenhauer. And Schopenhauer is a Platonist. You know, in the introduction to The World as Will and Representation, he says, like, in this work, I'm completing Plato's system. Now, ultimately, I think Schopenhauer is a degeneration away from Plato, not an improvement. But yeah, I mean, the idea of the archetypes, the idea of these different levels of the self, to me, that seems very clearly evident in Plato himself. The idea of the shadow and integrating what we've like disfavored, because that's a very good point you're raising. Like whenever we engage in some kind of identity construction through our actions, we rationalize to ourselves like, this is what I am and I'm not this. I'm a good person, I'm not a bad person. But in each one of those acts, we are like distinguishing that kind of being and non-being. And the non-being is the different from something in the sophist. We have to, in order to like see the totality of ourselves and get back to that essence, we have to kind of retrace those steps. Like each time I've said I'm not this, I've kind of like some aspect of myself is still attached to that non-being, is still kind of drawn down by that it's not an absence, because the things that we've rejected maintain that kind of potential energy, because they were all possible at one point. Like the way that we could have been, like if you end up having a certain political value, like there's easily a way of seeing your life go that you went the opposite way. So they still have that potential to influence what you may become. So the idea that Jung has to integrate that shadow, like, I think is very powerful. We have these like latent energies in us in the realm of potential, and it makes sense that they would be unconscious, because what is conscious is tied to what is formal, what is structured. What is unconscious is not fully formed. I've been kind of having an insight lately, basically, that like intelligence is just form, right? The realm of forms is the same as nous, the second hypostasis in Neoplatonism. The formal principle is the principle of intelligence. Like, it seems so simple, and it's like really at face value what Plato is saying, but applied to like Jungian psychology. Okay, so we have this like formal conscious aspect and this material potential, probability spectrum aspect of ourselves that nevertheless is structured. Because if it was wholly unstructured, it would have no reality. Because, the absence of form is like pure matter, and Neoplatonists say that pure matter doesn't exist. So no pure unconscious exists at a certain level, but yeah, that shadow of the formal properties that we do experience has to be there, just like extrapolating the logic of Platonism. So I see Jung like is very compatible with Platonic metaphysics.
Yeah, and also that he's aiming at oneness essentially in a very similar way to kind of the Platonic kind of ideal of the one. And yeah, just on that idea of connecting intelligence and form. I mean, I understand that anything that's intelligible is a form. That there's anything that we can grasp as one thing has that formal aspect. So it's unsurprising. Do you see? Is there an aspect then of the mind as an actualizer, like the mind can? I'm thinking about Peterson's making order out of chaos or habitable order out of chaos. That there's this ability in the mind and through language, I suppose, to capture things, to put them in concepts, which are maybe to better to say to identify forms in things, and that we're kind of continually making that order in a world that's continually breaking down, which is the entropy and the pure potential, the formlessness, which is called matter in the Platonic, Neoplatonic case, that we're pitting ourselves against that entropy with our minds. That's kind of the mind and the language is that's the sort of mission in Platonism that's underlying a lot of it, which sounds very Christian. I don't know that in terms of the logos, of following the logos, of making that order out of chaos. I don't know what you think about that, but
yeah, I think there's truth to it. I think it's interesting you tie it to entropy. I think the dichotomy that we're dealing with is really like classical information versus quantum information. And there's a trade-off relationship. Classical information specifies states compared to other states. So you're saying like this and not this. Whereas quantum information characterizes that realm of potential and doesn't differentiate. So it remains in the superposition. It kind of calculates across all of this probability space. So whenever we specify classical information, there's a corresponding loss in quantum information. The way that the world proceeds is characterized by a succession of classical states. Like you need the classical states in order to model the world as we see it. It's not purely quantum, right? Henry Stapp, in his book Quantum Theory and Free Will, says that like exactly what you said about like kind of constructing our values with our what we give attention to, and also like constructing the world with our values, because like what we attend to is contingent on those values. Stapp like traces that all the way down to the most fundamental like measurement process in quantum mechanics, and says that the way that it's modeled in the standard formalism, like the von Neumann formalism, there are these two discrete processes, like process 1 and process 2. There's the propagation of the wave function, and then there's the collapse event. And the only way to model that appropriately is with a query that's put into the system. So something outside of the system asks, is there a particle here? And it's that question that determines, for Henry Stapp, or actually a succession of questions that are kind of stacked atemporally. I don't fully understand. I'm not a physicist, but it connects to what you're saying. That question shapes what collapse actually does occur. So it is like attention or will in Schopenhauer's sense beyond time that ends up determining that classical state that we experience. Now, in that sense, then, like the experience of continued time, the potency to shape the world in that way is always coming from that formal principle. It's adding form to matter. You see this probability field, you're always structuring it, inevitably. So that's tied to the idea that there's some good in everything. So even though what we actualize may not end up to be good, the potential to do it, the power to do it, comes from this form dominating matter. And as far like form qua form is superior to matter qua matter, and so every instance of us forming the world, shaping the world, in some sense is good, because we're getting rid of some messy potential and instituting some concrete reality. But yeah, like at a higher level though, we have to recognize that there's like multiple levels of matter. Like for Platonists, there's like the substrate of the world itself, and then there's things that act as matter for higher formal principles. So in a sense, like bronze is matter to the statue, right? And even in the intelligible world, there's like the intelligible matter that acts as the substrate for the particular forms. So we have to recognize what is that matter that our action is applied at. And I think there are multiple levels of the unstructured and the material, and then multiple levels of the formal that is ultimately always aimed at the good. When we give our attention, like shaping the collapse of the wave function, or when we give our attention motivating action at the level of the perspectives we're taking, or at the level of the procedures that we're enacting, or at the level of the propositions, like we're always constraining that probability space at multiple levels. And yeah, so that's the thought.
I love that it always ends up with quantum physics, and then everybody's just kind of like, I don't know. I always end up there, and I'm like, definitely something there, but I just, yeah. But even on the Jung topic there, like that's so talking about the kind of hierarchy of being of this, like actualizing up the kind of hierarchies where Plotinus talks about, if you were, or Vervaeke, sorry, talks about like if you were a human being living like a plant, you'd be a failed, debauched human being, or if you're a human being living as an animal, you'd be a failed, debauched human being, and that there's this kind of implicit ideal in each level of it that we've kind of been talking about the whole time, but that in the hierarchy of being, then there's levels to it, and it's aspiration that takes us through these levels of being, and that it comes from attention. I mean, our Augustine defined lust, I think, as choosing a lower good over a higher good. And it seems like everything, the whole idea that everything has its time, like you can desire each thing, everything's a good, but there's an ordering to the goods, there's a hierarchy of them that needs ultimately the good at the top, the highest good that structures all the other goods, which I think is Augustine's pretty much definition of God as the absolute value that organizes all the relative values. And how to take that away, you're just going to end up with chaos. Like there's no other way of kind of doing it. And that's, I think, the argument why the Christian story is so inevitable is that it sets up that hierarchy of being all the way from God all the way down, and that there isn't another game. Like either it's that one or you break it.
Yeah. Yeah, it goes back to like Plato didn't invent these doctrines, and we don't have to invent new doctrines. The old ones are perfectly fine. I mean, I think. Yeah, we can update them and like inform modern scientific views with them. But I think, sometime in the distant past, people hit on this necessity that there is one first principle of being and goodness. There has to be, otherwise the world cannot be made sense of. Proclus in the Element of Theology says you can't have two first things, because what are those two first things that we can label them both? They have something in common if we can talk about both of them. And that commonality, like if they both are, for example, they both participate in being, and you need that being above them. With the good, if we have multiple goods, how do we determine that one thing is good? Well, unless there's a singular nature of goodness, we have ultimate relativism, and the notion of good is meaningless. Unless there's a unity to goodness, there is no goodness. Because any individual act can be judged according to any standard, and you can't have fixed standards unless you're dealing with one thing that you're studying here. Like any variable in psychology, you have to posit as this kind of essential thing in order to model it. Like, openness and the big five, neuroticism, whatever it is you're looking for, it has to have a fixed nature. It has to be one thing that you're tracking. There is no other way to do it. So that's why I've, over the years, after looking at the more modern stuff, I'm like, yeah, Plato had it all already, and we really don't have to innovate past him. And like enough people could benefit just from reading the dialogues that like that's what I'm doing in my groups. We'll just read the dialogues and like refresh our memory on how all of this started and how we used to think.
It's so true. Like our relentless focus on innovation kind of takes away from the fact that a big part of this should be trying to understand the tradition more, and that's actually okay. Like you don't have to invent a new system that fully explains everything. Like it's enough to understand Plato and to be able to actually, situate yourself within that worldview that can be meaningful, I think, as well, as
Right.
affording us wisdom and virtue. There was something there that I wanted to jump on, which was the kind of conflict maybe between big B being and being as true reality. Like that the good is that you can't add any adjectives to it or anything. It's it's the thing above all, or it's not a thing. It's the where the true reality that all things are situated within. Do you think that conflicts with the Christian account? I've heard
No.
such like
Yeah.
different things. I really don't
Not
know. Like,
not with pseudo Dionysius. I mean,
yeah,
if you're in Eastern Orthodoxy or Catholicism, you embrace the teachings of Dionysius, seemingly. And I mean, he makes it very explicit. Like, Godhead is not an existent thing. In a way, he's saying, like,
not
Godhead
a
doesn't
being.
exist because it's the principle of being. So, maybe there are Catholics out there who wouldn't accept that because Thomas Aquinas, the way he phrases it, he talks about God as like being itself. But there, it's an analogical statement. It's not that like God simply is this property being that is distributed among all existing things. It's that like the way that the being of things relates to like them as foundations, God relates to, being in general as that foundation. So that's the analogy I think that Aquinas is employing there, because Aquinas was a believer in like apophatic theology, following the tradition via negativa of Dionysius. So we can't directly predicate anything of Godhead, of that ultimate unity, even in Platonism, the one, the good. These are analogical labels. We only know what to call them
Mm,
by seeing what is exemplary and superior in the world around us and in what we can grasp of the intelligibles. But,
mm.
Proclus will say too, we can't actually ascend beyond that. I think the authentic, like, intellectual Christian tradition fully recognizes that.
Yeah, because I think that's a big stumbling point a lot of the time is the kind of personal creator god idea of almost like a Michelangelo type of, guy in the sky thing that stops, I think, yeah, causes conflicts with the secular attitude of seeming almost a bit, I don't know, yeah, just fantastical or something. So I've heard it described in different ways. Do you think for Aquinas it was a to do with Aristotle a little bit? Because I know Aristotle, I don't know if this is correct actually, but his first principle is the kind of unmoved mover, the self-thinking, and that's kind of in Platonism anyway. That wouldn't be the one. Would that be below the one because it can think itself? Um,
Right. Yeah, Aristotle's first principle seems to be the demiurge,
yes,
which,
in Platonism, yeah.
yeah,
But that creates a very different, if that's the first principle, because Aristotle has then a kind of logically closed system. And do you think that's what kind of underlies a lot of the modern rationalism? I mean, DC Schindler's work is has a really good point of like, what's the rational argument for rationality? You can't give a rational argument for rationality that doesn't presuppose its validity. So it has to rest on something else, which in Platonism is the good. That's what underlies the our mind's ability to understand the world.
right. Yeah, I think it is a problem, and it does stem from Aristotle. But I wonder to what extent Aristotle was cloaking his Platonism, and I've even wondered, why didn't Aristotle succeed Plato in the academy? Why did Plato choose his nephew Sisyphus? Maybe Plato and Aristotle recognized that it would be better if we had two different directions of focus that were like in a sense independent. This is, Vervaeke would characterize that as opponent processing, right? So we have
Mm.
that like starting from the intelligible and moving down to the sensible, and then we have starting from what's intelligible and ascending to the super
Mm.
intelligible. Of course, both, kind of go beyond that. Platonism, in a sense, starts from the sensible, goes all the way to the top and back down. But like that focus on the sensible world and not looking at sensibles qua their instantiation of intelligibles, but looking at sensibles qua sensibles. Like Plato doesn't encourage that, and that's not the focus of the pedagogy. Aristotle encourages that, and without that empirical focus, Western civilization probably wouldn't exist as we know it. It might, classical Athens, minus Alexander's conquests, might have turned out looking more like Egyptian civilization if you just took a strict Platonism. Would they be inventing new mechanisms? I think Plato was fully aware of that, because in the Republic he says the person who should be compelled to return back into the cave will see the shadows 10,000 times better. So, yeah, maybe, was the peripatetic school itself, the Lyceum, like I don't know, some kind of conspiracy in a certain sense, a noble lie that,
Yeah, like a
Plato came
testing
up
ground
with
for
Aristotle.
something.
I don't know.
Yeah, and it does seem to really root the kind of nominalist problem as well, or the empirical bend of the issues around just the focus on what's intelligible to the eye or what can be seen, rather than the bias against forms or against the type of even the future self or the good, and how that actually exists within a Platonic framework. Anyway, Vervaeke talks about that, like the hole in
Right.
the scientific ontology, which is that on the one hand it's all empirical and human beings have to do the work, but on the other hand human beings are so unreliable that it has to be this kind of impersonal method that removes human beings. So you're like, how do you have both of those things at the same time if we're not capable somehow of perceiving these important patterns?
Right. I think, yeah, that's part of the dialectical method as well. Like, at certain times, Socrates acts as if he knows certain things. At other times, he unknows them so that he can come to know them better. Right? There has to be that process of unknowing, the kind of via negativa of Dionysius. And it's an art that, yeah, we've kind of unconsciously practiced in some ways, like what was John Locke ultimately on about with his ideas of empiricism, or Francis Bacon. You know, did were they like true believing empiricists exclusively, or did they see that we had to kind of unknow certain truths about the higher realm so that we could like get that shift in perspective and come to know the shadows a little bit better? Yeah, it's hard to tell, and it's interesting also that a lot of these like Anglo empiricist philosophers, like, they had a background in Hermeticism. They weren't ignorant of these Platonic ideas, and you even see like, I think, oblique references to Platonic themes in Locke, in David Hume. So I think there's a deeper history behind the Enlightenment, that like, were these like just rationalists or empiricists alternatively kind of making a mistake, being myopic, or or was there like an awareness of the deeper unity behind both at some level? Maybe it was an unconscious level, but yeah, there too we had this kind of opponent processing, rationalism, empiricism, and you need that bracketing in order, I think, to like explore both paths in their fullest. That's why like Platonism can't be reduced into just one system. You need to be able to forget and revisit and come back. That process of forgetting and recollecting is so important.
Yeah, and
Yeah.
that Socrates exemplifies that so well, and that he exemplifies the good ultimately for Plato, and that's kind of it, because like people talk about the Socratic method, and I know he says like he doesn't actually have a method, like he does the opposite thing at times all over the place. The point is the kind of search for the truth, but that you know within the kind of Plato exemplifies that dramatically, but the perfection of the drama is the philosophy almost. It's a radically different
Yeah.
kind of philosophy and pursuit of truth
It's what
than
gives
the
the
academic
dialogues their
version.
beauty, I think, that there is a deeper unity that's not obvious, just like the good is the first principle of reality isn't obvious, but it accounts for that oneness that the whole work, the organic unity the whole work has, that confers that beauty. So where we see tensions, there's often like a deeper thing going on.
Yeah, and hopefully, I mean, where can people find your work, Eric? Where's best for them to go to learn more about this? Because I'm sure people will want to tuck into more Platonism to get over the meaning crisis after this conversation.
Yeah, I hope so. So I do a podcast with Keith Woods, Understanding Platonism, and then I have my own YouTube channel, Understanding Plato. So those are the two main platforms. I need to post more on both of those, but we're trying here.
Of course, and it's difficult to keep it all going, but it's significant work, and hopefully we can chat again in the future because I really love your insights here. I found it super beneficial, so thanks for your time.
Thank you very much. I checked out a few episodes of your podcast. I think you do great work as well. So looking forward to more of it.